Hello and welcome back to the Innovators of Public Safety. Today we're joined by Morgan Hitzig. She's a venture investor at Venrock, a friend and an officer in the United States Navy Reserve as well. Let's just say she keeps busy. So Morgan brings a pretty unique blend of operational and strategic experience that I was really excited to bring to the pod. She's served with the NYPD and the Counterterrorism Bureau, and as an early employee at Peregrine Technologies, which recently raised an impressive $190 million Series C. She's also a former data miner employee and has a deep bench of experience in leveraging technology for public safety and intelligence. A huge thanks to Morgan for hosting us at the Venrock offices for this podcast in Manhattan. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know I did. Let's get to it. So, Morgan, first, thanks for being on and for doing this in the offices here, and an awesome view. I think an upgrade from our normal studio environment. But you and I kind of got to know each other through a couple of kind of seemingly random connections. We were both reservists, former active duty people. You had a stint in a public safety company, now a venture capital investor. Lots of different overlap. But I thought maybe where we would get started is on your current job right now, your current role at Venrock, and what is your thesis? What are you going after? What's interesting right now? What gets you excited?
To Bryant Park. Pretty nice day here in New York City, 50 degrees and sunny.
Did my best to miss it.
Yeah.
Wrong train, but yeah.
So current role, venture investor with Venrock. I was hired mostly focused on dual use defense tech. As you know, and as I'm sure many of your listeners know, defense tech is sort of all the rage at the moment.
Yep.
So,
Hot.
Very hot. The areas that I have been focused on, I've just made an investment in a company called GenLogs. So very much focused on kind of building and moving in the physical world. So what are the companies that are focused on how we move things from a supply chain perspective, how we move things from a logistics perspective?
Yeah.
There's a critical component to where I've been focused on the industrial base side and where are we kind of falling behind as a country. I think on the defense side, it's much more oriented on contested logistics. But the companies I've been looking at in that building and moving in the physical world space
DIB.
Really focused. Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly.
So the actual building of things.
Have not done hardware really, so more like the software component.
Yep.
But I would actually maybe categorize GenLogs in an area where I'm super excited, which is kind of that high margin hardware. So they've got a sensor suite, but what is being optimized is much more focused on the software side. So that's one particular piece of it. I think the other piece I would just mention is, and I'll steal this from another firm, Atlas, who we actually worked with on that deal, this kind of data gushers concept of focusing on companies that are creating net new data.
Give an example, what would be a net new data?
So I think, GenLogs is actually a good example. I'll pull that.
Sure. Yeah.
Kind of sensing, capturing, refining of data that doesn't otherwise exist. So they have a network of sensors on interstate highways. Mm-hmm. They are the only ones to be gathering that particular slice of commercial sensor feed data, and now they can propagate it across a variety of different industries everywhere, from freight brokerages, which is where they're focused today, to auto insurers, to in the future potentially law enforcement, using that for everything from fraud to kind of actionable insights on the carrier shipper map.
Okay, and maybe even my mind starts going towards it's also usage data, so it can go into almost into maybe this is a stretch, but predictive maintenance. I mean, you can start to see kind of so a new process of data. So Venrock as a firm, is this the only thing you guys do? For those that don't know, obviously I know a little bit more about Venrock, but where do you guys traditionally focus? Where have you been focused?
Venrock's an amazing firm. It's been in business. It sort of was one of the OG venture capital firms in the Valley. I think some of our earlier investments, or at least the kind of major headline investments, include the Intels, the Apples.
That's a pretty cool story.
In San Francisco, Palo Alto, that has basically showing Venrock has more shares in Apple than Steve Wozniak did when we originally invested. So very long history. Have some background on the industrial side and partnering with labs early on. But we are very much a generalist firm. We have sort of two sides of the investment team, a healthcare team that focuses on everything from biotech to healthcare IT. And then on the technology side of the house, which is where I sit, very much generalist with a couple of key practice areas. Aerospace and defense is one of them, fintech, developer tools. We've got a couple of space investments. So definitely have taken the leap into
you guys are all in
hardware, but the kind of barrier to entry is high there.
Yeah. So this podcast audience is like a kind of an interesting smorgasbord. We have investors that are in the public safety space. We have some gov tech, defense tech mixed in. I had Garrett Smith from Reveal Technology on very recently. But then we also have your street cops that are like using the technology that a lot of these firms are inventing and investors are investing in. So I think they'll be very interested in one of your previous roles, which is Peregrine. Tell us a little bit of your story at Peregrine and maybe Peregrine's story now that they've kind of just kept going.
So Peregrine is I cannot say enough good things about that business. I met Nick Noon in late, I think 2018, so very early Peregrine days. And what struck me about the company very early on was just his commitment to building with the customer. He was still working out of the San Pablo Police Department, so took very seriously what does it mean to be co-located, and spent a whole bunch of time focused on homicide cases and how does data connect within one of those cases, and really built a product around it based on his experience at Palantir.
That's right, he's a Palantir guy.
To build for the public safety use case because he felt like the innermost circle of how you can kind of protect and serve a community is through law enforcement, and that very much resonated with me, having spent some time at NYPD. So that was where Peregrine started. My role when I joined in 2021, I believe, or late 2021.
Peak COVID almost.
To Afghanistan, I came back and I called
Welcome.
Nick Noon and I said, I want to come join your company because it is a rocket ship to the moon. And like he had really kind of figured out what law enforcement needed from a data integration standpoint.
Now, your title there, I think, was head of growth, but did you come in as head of growth? And I'm guessing that meant that product market fit was established and it was like time to run, right? Is that the right frame, or like what was day one?
Yeah, so day one was interesting. It was, I think I was maybe employee 17 or 18.
Good size right now.
The majority of the team was still on the engineering side, as it should have been. So head of growth probably was not what where it was sort of like pick up a shovel and we're all gonna start to run at how do we build like a real go-to-market organization. So day one was very focused on figuring out the right kind of marketing channels. We had done a fantastic job of getting out there and scaled anywhere outside of California. So created partnerships with Major City Chiefs Association, and really just wanted to kind of map the different ways that law enforcement technology gets in the hands of end users, and that's everything from events at the national stage,
the IACPs of the world,
to advisors on the much more local stage.
What was this is a purely selfish question as the CEO of a law enforcement technology startup, but what was the critical unlock? Major city chiefs, got it, makes sense. IACP, got it, makes sense. What was something you guys did that was a little different, that you felt like kind of took you to the next level?
I think it may sound a little bit cliche, but I think the customer testimonials from the small departments was helpful, particularly for a more regionalization strategy. But once we wanted to go towards major city police departments, it only really took one. It took one kind of big believer who was willing to see the vision and see it early. Peregrine case, I was Chief Harold Medina in Albuquerque. They were our, I think, third customer.
And probably first out of California, maybe.
It's outside of California. He really believed and started to track measurements like homicide case closure rates, and Peregrine actually impacted those, which is sort of the holy grail when it comes to law enforcement technology.
So on that note, first customer outside of California, it seems like the approach that you guys took was kind of, I don't know if is this the right way to say it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like you went super deep with your early customers. So you're embedded at San Pablo PD, and then you find a couple of other customers and kind of do the same thing. Because it's been my experience inside this industry that, of the 18,000 agencies that everybody knows, that, that kind of big scary number, there's almost like 15,000 ways of doing business. How were you able to take what you saw in Albuquerque and these other California agencies and like replicate something across the industry?
I think there were a couple of key trends that were happening in 2021, 2022, and 2023, which was sort of the years that I was with Peregrine. We were kind of coming out of the pendulum that swung in 2020, and you had law enforcement agencies that were short police officers. So it was sort of this concept of how do we do more with less from a personnel perspective? How can we think about ways to retain the officers that we do have? Technology was a super critical component to it. We were starting to get into the era where 50% of these major agencies had only been on the job for less than 5 years. In a profession, I was going to say industry, but it's truly a profession. In a profession,
so similar to the military, right?
Where, exactly. In a profession where you need to learn on the job. Like the people who came before you know how the game is played, and it is a tremendous responsibility that, at least when I was at the police department, I felt like the folks who came before me really took seriously.
Well, I mean, and crime's like a social phenomenon as much as anything, right? So it's not just how do you make an arrest, how do you pull a car over for a traffic violation. It's also which social network is this person we've seen 4 times this week a part of, which potential gang affiliation. Like it's this like web of contextual social information that they need to have, which maybe the Palantir guy is the right guy to figure that out. So.
Also say just law enforcement is this amazing buyer, and I think this is something that actually most of the venture capital community hasn't like quite yet caught on to. But law enforcement is an amazing buyer because they tell you exactly what they need and exactly what is going on and going wrong, and you can see it in the city every day. Like you can see when there is a spike in violent crime in a particular part of a city, or there's a follow home task force that's being stood up in LA for very specific reasons. So it is challenging because you have to kind of tailor what you're doing for a particular agency. But it's also this amazing superpower from a go-to-market perspective because you know exactly what your customer is.
It's a super interesting frame. I actually haven't considered it that way, but we both have a military hat that we wear. And that side of things, we're preparing for a high-end fight with a near peer or peer adversary who doesn't tell us their plans, and therefore our customer doesn't know what they exactly need to build. So if you're selling to DoD, like you have a good idea that drones are a part of it, and autonomy is a part of it. But then you come into our space in law enforcement, and they will tell you tomorrow we're standing up this task force and we need it to support X, Y, and Z. Yeah, it's an interesting frame. Maybe something the other venture capital firms will start paying attention to.
But it's also just like it is truly a massive market. And I don't think we've done a good job of contextualizing it. And I think the other piece is just for venture, repeatable sales cycles really matter. And that is something that is just really challenging to your point of like every jurisdiction is different. Like we even at Peregrine had different strategies for different parts of the country. So everything from like the Southeast was a very specific strategy. They were dealing with like a major fentanyl crisis. You could come, of course, but how you focused for different parts of the country, I think, was another sort of superpower that is underappreciated.
I thought it was, we were saying like not necessarily doing a good job contextualizing this market. It's actually probably the biggest, I don't want to say like publicly, but like it's the biggest struggle I have as a CEO in this space is explaining TAM. Right, and explaining all the places that you can go in this market, and explaining that yes, the buying cycle is a little bit longer you do a good job, these are relationship-based sales that, can go for a long time. It's a very sticky industry, and I think can be quite attractive to a venture scale investor. So it's been, I think, it's tough to do because people just look at 18,000 departments and they figure out a rough ACV and then they call that the market. Look at Axon.
I think the other underappreciated thing is a lot of the challenges that law enforcement have. Either you can go, I guess what I'll call upmarket on the federal side, particularly with a business like yours, where you are sort of crossing those boundaries between agencies. And then when you can move across a city, that's another very powerful unlock. And for most cities, you've got not just law enforcement, but you've got fire and emergency management. And you've got major parts of the criminal justice system that also have sort of law enforcement-like capabilities. Yeah. And maybe that's just because most of my prior experience was here in New York City with NYPD, but I think you have it on the smaller scale cities as well.
Funny, I encourage my sales team to get gritty is like a thing that we say. And one of the kind of outputs from a recent get gritty session, if you can call it that, was, hey, we have this footprint in Florida. What can we do around it? How can we enrich the data sharing network that's there? And one of the guys says, well, what about Fish and Game? They're constantly talking about poachers and needing to share information about poachers and talk about an interjurisdictional thing down in the Everglades. And so it's a part of the market that we hadn't even considered in TAM, but well, of course we can go talk to those guys. So and NYPD is a special animal. Everyone looks to them from what they're acquiring and purchasing, but they also touch, I don't know how many other agencies.
Share this, and I hope I don't get in trouble with former NYPD brethren, but I would absolutely not start there from a law enforcement startup perspective. We at Peregrine made a very deliberate decision, one, to keep conversations open and help support on whatever use cases they came to us with, but didn't run a sort of very proactive sales cycle because, to your point earlier, trust is paramount, and you've got to deliver, and you've got to be able to deliver at scale. And at 36,000 sworn, I think it's still 36,000 sworn law enforcement agency is a total bear. And so until you can actually do it and actually
support
deliver, it's worth waiting.
I had on that note, had a conversation with a high-ranking person at NYPD very early on. I'd kind of networked my way and gotten to speak to who definitely are the right people. And he gave me some sage advice, and he said, Matt, I love what you're doing. This looks awesome. Don't talk to us until you've been in business 5 years and can support us, because we're too big. You need to be able to actually facilitate this deployment. You might be able to deploy the software, but then what, right? And to that end, we've adopted a very similar strategy of going after major cities, sure, but not NYPD off the beat.
The things, and I'll credit this to one of Peregrine's very early investors, Adam Ross. He said to me, actually, as I was interviewing, because we had a ton of inbound demand from Peregrine, it was just sort of choosing where to go first. He shared an adage that is well known across the valley, which is that startups die from indigestion, not from starvation. And that was something that we really took to heart. And so if you're going to go deploy with LAPD, knock LAPD out of before you go anywhere else. Yeah,
echoes of our deployments inside of Boston. The advice to the team was just, this is your own, we hired a guy just for this. Your only job is to make them happy. And it's proving out because they're willing to reference for us and start to spread. You've mentioned it a little bit, but can we talk a little bit about your time at NYPD and kind of first of all, how the hell did you get there? No shade, but how did you get there? What's that? And then, what was the role?
It's so interesting to think back on it now. So NYPD, born and raised New Yorker.
Okay.
And I was here on 9/11. I was actually homesick from school for the only time in my, basically all of my school career, middle school, high school.
Yeah.
And I remember it so vividly, and I can kind of trace back a lot of my professional decisions to that day, which I think many can from our sort of generation. But I discovered NYPD counterterrorism in college and decided that was my dream job. And I got out of graduate school, so I did a BA/MA at Johns Hopkins. I got out of graduate school and I applied to NYPD, and I had to apply 6 times before they ever called me back. And when they called me back, it was only because I had sort of similarly like found somebody to have coffee with me.
Yeah. Network in.
Because they were so oversubscribed for the one job that I was interested in doing, which was being an analyst on their counterterrorism or intel.
Is that the JTTF or is it a different?
It's actually separate, and the bureaus have reorganized a bit since I was there even, but the JTTF was under counterterrorism, and then you had the Intel Bureau, which was much more focused on cases that the NYPD was lead investigator on. Okay. And I was in this amazing role where I got to kind of support both. I did a ton of work on the police commissioner's daily brief, which was just this amazing time where you see the kind of seedy underbelly of the city that I grew up in. So it was an amazing way to contribute from a safety and security perspective, and actually inspired me to join the military.
So that was first, okay. Yeah.
So NYPD was first, and probably about 6 months into my NYPD time, realized that I wanted to be in uniform. There was just something that was missing, and there was also this feeling that NYPD played the home game, and I wanted to also play the away game. So I joined the Navy as a reservist. So I've actually always been reserves.
Okay, I had that wrong,
Do both. I had an unbelievably supportive chief. I worked for Chief Jim Waters, and he was amazing around supporting my Navy career. And then on the Navy side, I felt like a better intelligence officer because I had this in-depth understanding of how you run an intel investigation at the city level.
Yeah. Did you, like, on the Intel side in the Navy, like, what was the focus there? So you go to Intel school, right?
Yeah.
Or you go direct commission and then Intel school, and then where do you go?
My first unit was actually at the Pentagon, which is kind of this crazy place to land.
Weird place for an ensign.
And salute. Actually, my first day ever in uniform was at the Pentagon, and it was a super hot April day, and I remember this so well because I had bought a broken belt buckle, but I didn't realize, so I just wore it, but felt like I was the idiot who couldn't figure out how the belt buckle worked.
They are a little weird with the little flap in there.
Know. But it was broken, so I end up wearing the Eisenhower jacket because I can't figure out the belt. And
sweating your butt off. Yeah.
Classic. Yeah. That was probably the only classic part of my first day on the job at the Pentagon.
What was the unit? Can you say the unit you're attached to? Or?
CNOIP was my first unit. But one of the things that was amazing about being at the police department as I joined the Navy was we had a ton of units come through New York City. And they would do a lot of training here.
Yeah.
Because I sort of walked in both of these worlds.
Liaison
to any of the units that were coming to New York. So I got to support some amazing folks at the JTTF on the NYPD side who kind of taught me everything I needed to know, and then made some really good connections that kind of led to a lot of my deployed time afterwards. Yeah,
super cool. Experience of my first day in the Navy was very different. It was face down in the mud in Newport.
Nice.
At Officer Candidate School with a Marine Corps drill instructor screaming that he thought I needed to shave again because, as you can see, this is after a morning shave. Slightly different. But then, Pensacola, Florida Flight School, I'm familiar with being extremely hot in uniform. So let's talk a little bit. This is kind of more just near and dear to my heart, is like the officer, you're wearing this hat. I know you're having to travel for reserves now. I'm going to Japan next month for 2 weeks and also running a company. How do you balance it? What sucks? What's awesome? Yeah, let's just dig into that a little bit, because this is something that I think about a lot, and I actually hope to hire more people that are reservists, because I do think it does bring a nice synergy, but it's also some demand.
I had a meeting yesterday with some reserve leadership folks, and I was reminded, and I'm going to borrow from the Army Reserve for a second.
Yeah.
But they have this kind of slogan, twice the citizen, around being in the Army Reserve. We don't have that on the Navy side.
Yeah.
But I thought that that was a really interesting way of putting it, because we are now kind of in this moment in time, particularly because I'm spending so much time orienting on the defense innovation ecosystem in space, and a variety of ways that manifests, everything from the policy side to the tech talent side, and being able to kind of bridge that both from the venture capital hat, which is I get to meet mission-driven founders all day long who are building amazing teams filled with folks who want to go support hard problems that maybe were underloved by really good entrepreneurs over the last 2 decades, let's say, and help them better understand some of the operational use cases that I get to see on the reserve side. So I've been super fortunate to be able to support Naval Special Warfare for the last several years. And so being able to operationalize new technology both for them, not helping them with the contracting side, but once they buy something new, like how do we actually make sure that it gets utilized? And then also connecting the kind of innovation ecosystem, not the innovation theater ecosystem, but people who like actually want to move the ball forward to those communities has been really.
So not the DIUs of the world, but like the individual operator, or what do you mean?
Yeah, I think
or yes, both. I mean, what?
I would say yes, both to an extent. I would say more the individual operator, because I think, and then this goes back to how Nick and Ben kind of built Peregrine, like proximity to the user is everything.
Yeah.
That was my first real experience with sort of user-centered design, for lack of a word. Like,
it is. I mean, that's what it is.
Less close to it. I would say Peregrine showed me the value there. I've been able to then take that lesson and teach it, frankly, to a lot of folks on the reserve side and to the active duty side, to say, here's why companies want to talk to you. Here are the ways in which it's okay for you to share your experience and for people to actually build with you, the end user, in mind.
It is really heartening, just as a reservist. Like when I was active duty and in uniform, when I had transitioned to the Poseidon, the P-8, I got to go up to St. Louis a few times and be in the Boeing factories and up there testing software and doing all these things. But it always felt like the Boeing guys didn't know how to talk to us, and we didn't know if it was okay to talk to them, even though we're under contract in a plane that they're building for us. But it never felt like it's funny, it's actually a skill set to be able to talk to an entrepreneur, a company, actually be able to do something with that information. So it's good to hear, I guess, is what I'm saying, that you guys are doing that and letting the military component understand, hey, these guys aren't always just sharking you. They like legitimately need to talk to you because they don't know how you do your job.
The other thing we're getting better at, sort of in an adjacent way, is just how do we mobilize expertise, not personnel. Like we're getting much better, particularly in the age of, I don't even think you can call it big data anymore, but like we are past big data to how do we take that data and leverage AI to actually put the right uniform member against the right problem. And you can do it in those 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. It's better if you can do it a little bit more on call, but there is certainly a desire, and we're seeing this with like the Marine Innovation Unit, the unit that I'm in, which is Naval Special Warfare's Innovation Unit. There are several others, the 75th Innovation Command for the Army. I'm forgetting somebody, sorry.
We had a couple of folks there, AFWER, et cetera.
But there's a real feeling of like, let's take the talent that our kind of best and brightest that have now left active duty service and have now served in all of these amazing companies across the country. How do we leverage that expertise and when those folks are new?
It makes me think, this is a project I don't have time to take on, so good idea, Ferry. But like, does that exist in law enforcement and public safety? Like this model, like the DIU is obviously kind of the OG at this point. And then all the iterations you just kind of fired off, like where's the FBI's? And does it exist? And could it possibly have the same effect with how our framers designed the federated law enforcement system here? I know NYPD's got innovation stuff going on, but why isn't every agency doing this?
So interesting. I've seen like NYPD as an auxiliary. Should we have a digital auxiliary? Probably. And frankly, they may. I just don't know.
I don't either. I should probably know that.
But I love that idea. I think we've seen pockets of what does it look like to bring talent back into law enforcement. But I think we've seen it more on the, I'm forgetting the responder, like the co-responder model.
Yeah.
More of the, like, how do you have someone who can respond and have the mental health conversation?
It's like the social science innovation.
And more of the, exactly. Versus how do we build great tech for a very tactical use case on the law enforcement.
I've seen obviously the IACP technology conference is exciting. There's always like interesting talks and, stuff going on there, but it is a bit of a corporate show of check out our stuff. It's a, warehousing, look at all of our cool toys. Not necessarily a focused, and it would have to be, I haven't put a ton of thought into this, but it would have to be the LAPDs, the Chicago PDs, the NYPDs, like almost working together to like foster an innovation cell around the country. I don't know. This, again, if this happens, it's my idea. Morgan and I invented it on this podcast live, but I don't know. It seems like there's room, I guess. I like the model. Wish that we could do it inside of public safety.
I think one of the things that's missing in public safety that we've seen, at least in the last couple of years on the defense ecosystem side, is just you've got players who are telling the story. And it's not necessarily, it seems to me, and I haven't been to ICP Tech in a couple of years, but it seems to me that when I went to that conference, and it's so well done from an organizational perspective, there's so many moving pieces, so hats off to the ICP folks. But you've got sort of like the senior leaders from a law enforcement perspective, and then you have vendors. And like there's sort of this demarcation line between vendor and senior law enforcement leader. To some extent that is required because there are obviously kind of like clear rules of the road, and what's challenging in law enforcement is those rules are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction versus in the federal ecosystem where it's just super clear.
Here's the FAR.
Go read it, and that's the letter of the law. But what is missing is sort of this set of ecosystem players who are not on one side versus the other. Because in defense tech, I think you've got a ton of VCs who are bringing a voice to the table. I think you've got a lot of folks who have left. You've got books like Freedom's Forge, Arsenal of Democracy that are starting to bring people the narrative of like, wait a second, we actually have to get really organized around a threat that may be pretty meaningful.
And soon.
Exactly.
That's, not to bang on it too hard, but that's getting some good ideas. I wonder if we could put something together. When I was at the Kennedy School in Sloan, I was first kind of introduced to like Silicon Valley Defense Group and like that group. Like even those kind of like, arguably are auxiliaries, but they're there feeding the ecosystem, making connections between the two. And I did feel we did our first IACP this year. Kind of a side saddle with Mark 43, who we have a partnership with. It felt like, there was this like very clear line of like, here comes a chief. Like, there wasn't a good cross-pollination. Like, of course we're in the same innovation cells and in the same conversations together. So it was definitely sort of felt like Switzerland in some ways. Like we could talk to each other here, but I'm not sure how well developed the conversations go unless you're an Axon, right? Or maybe a Peregrine at this point.
There's also just a lot of those conferences, which is where you see most of your customers, because it's still, like, that's still very much the culture.
For sure.
To be part of the conversation, it's still a little bit of a pay to play. And so I think there is an opportunity there to create conversation in a way that's a little bit more informal or on the sideline. There's so many things going on, so it's really tough to get people's attention during those major conferences. But it's definitely an area that I think could be improved, is just like, what is the joint task force, for lack of a better word, is
who's convening it
on the vendor side, folks on the law enforcement side, and we do it in a way where all the incentives are aligned.
One of the questions I've been kind of asking people is like, what's your spicy take on law enforcement? So a little out of the blue, but I'm curious, like, you've seen it from the outside, or seen it from the inside rather, inside of Peregrine growing, but then you've now seen it as a venture investor. What's the spicy take on law enforcement, public safety?
This is a super spicy take, but I think one of the things that has always frustrated me about this particular domain is there is a pretty major misconception that the customer doesn't get technology. Like, there's just a understanding of the level of sophistication of the potential end user. And I hear that a lot in venture, talking about public safety. I think it's happening less and less because I think, frankly, law enforcement agencies are finding very experienced people to lead their technology efforts. And it's not that they don't get it, it's that they're skeptical, and they should be, because they've been underserved by technology for a long time. And so to me, it's almost like a lazy answer of like, oh, no, that agency just doesn't get it.
Yeah.
It's like, no, you didn't sell it right if they have to get it, number one, or number two, like, they don't trust you. And so that's the other piece of this, which is just, and probably not a spicy take, but like a word not from the wise, maybe. Is this is an industry where people want to see the same face year after year. If I go to MCCA, human from my law enforcement days, like Lenny Nerbetsky was there with me every single time. And the reason why is because Lenny is in some ways synonymous with Peregrine.
Yeah.
When he shows up somewhere, people trust him. And they trust that based on his 20 years of experience in Albuquerque and New Jersey State Police, like, he knows what he's talking about. So I don't know if it's spicy, but culture's everything, and don't underestimate the customer.
Yeah, perfect. It's kind of one of these things that I've had a few of those kind of the elder statesmen of law enforcement come put their arm around me and say, Matt, make sure that, if Joe's going to sell it to this guy, make sure Joe's always selling it to this guy. And so the same kind of thing. We haven't talked too much about it because I don't know how much of a law enforcement footprint they have, but data miner, obviously I touched on it when I was in the military. I knew the service, but do they have any law enforcement exposure, or are they doing anything with law enforcement?
Yeah, it's actually how I sort of discovered data miner. I was a user of data miner at NYPD.
Okay.
So I had this amazing experience. It was super early days of the product.
Yeah.
It was still like mostly Twitter. Now I think it's a million different sources.
Sure.
That is not an overstatement. Like, I actually do think it's close to a million, if not more. And I remember so vividly, I was sitting in one of those sort of police commissioner daily brief meetings with my then deputy commissioner, John Miller, and there was an alert that came out that somebody had driven a vehicle through a bunch of pedestrians in Times Square.
Yeah.
And we hadn't heard it on the radio. Nobody had come into this meeting and told us.
Yeah.
Like, the first indicator was a data miner alert, and we're all sitting in this conference room. And that deputy commissioner got in the car. I mean, obviously, like, made a couple phone calls, but got in the car and went to the scene, and he was there before emergency services.
Wow.
I don't know.
Nuts.
He was there, and the reason why was because we had a data miner alert. And so that was, for me, a very tangible example of what publicly available information could do, indications and warnings perspective. And in the world of public safety, where minutes are everything, especially minutes at the start of a critical incident, like, they are lives.
That's a really interesting story. What's kind of interesting is, like, on the Navy side of the house, you don't really get to do your job unless there's a war in some ways. And for many parts of the service, special warfare being a little bit different. But these guys get to do their job every day, right? So if you're law enforcement, I've started kind of talking about this as let's see how this lands with you. Like, public safety is homeland safety. So it's almost like it's this first ring, before you even start to think about the external defense of the country. And I started framing it that way, one, because I wanted to start to include public safety in the defense tech excitement that was out there, of course. But I also think it's truly the case that these are like the first ring of defense that we have.
Absolutely. And it's a first ring of defense, and it's so interesting. And I probably, I make a real point of this. And it maybe sounds a little bit cheesy, but I try to shake the hand of a cop every day, which is pretty doable because we're in Bryant Park and it's pretty safe.
Yeah. And passed a few on the way here.
The reason why is because, and I'm sure, I hope you can relate to this based on your military experience, you get a lot of support and thanks, and there's just infrastructure for military folks that is unbelievable. So grateful for how we take care of our veterans and feel tremendously supported. I'm not sure every veteran does, but I certainly do. And then you think about it on the law enforcement side, and I have to say, I'm not to compare and contrast, but law enforcement is such a hard job because if you deploy and you come home, like you stop in Germany on the way back, you have a couple of weeks,
Yep.
you're coming back from a
Calmly.
Exactly. And for law enforcement, you see a reality, like you see that underbelly and you see it every day, and you see the absolute worst day somebody's ever had. You also sometimes see the absolute best, and those are really great days. But then you go and you sleep next to your spouse and you like wake up and make your kids breakfast, and you don't have that same separation. And so from my perspective, it is a heck of a hard job.
Yeah. It's funny, we always talk about PTSD and in the concept of veterans, but I think there are a lot of good companies starting to spring up now around law enforcement health, mental health and PTSD treatment. I'll shout out to there's a couple companies out there. There's Sworn AI, there's Sigma Tactical Health, and they're doing these wraparound services because these guys die younger because of the extreme stress for long periods of time. It's a macho culture, so they don't talk about it. Even though it might save their life in many ways, they have a high suicide rate. Like all these different things that we would traditionally associate, we talk about with vets, but we don't think about with our law enforcement professionals. So, yeah, I'm in the same camp. So, well, I want to just kind of a couple more things before we close out. But you spend a lot of time thinking about technology. As an investor, you have to look at trends and where things are going. Where do you see tech in our space going? What are some of the interesting trends going on right now outside of just Peregrine and multitude? But where are things going? Yeah.
So I think I've been thinking about this a lot lately, because one of the things that Venrock does is we incubate companies. So shout out to anyone who's thinking about incubating. Public safety technology company. Matt has my phone number. But I've been thinking about it a lot because the space has consolidated a lot over the last couple of years. You've got the Axons of the world, the Flock Safeties of the world. And so thinking about what pieces of those puzzles could really use an overhaul, and where generative AI is today can actually completely change some of the workflows that we've gotten used to.
Yeah.
Now, again, law enforcement is inherently human, so there's only so far you can go.
Yep.
Even though there are tons of books, what is it, The Last Policeman?
Yep.
There are tons of, pieces of the ecosystem that talk about the fact that maybe pieces of it don't always have to be so human. It is inherently human. And so what are those areas where this kind of next generation of sensor fusion, this next generation of autonomy, this next generation of AI can actually unlock ways that law enforcement agencies can better work? And I haven't quite figured it out yet. I do think there are some pieces that could be disintermediated where we've just consolidated so much. Why do I have to buy an Axon body-worn camera? Why is that the case? Is that the best technology? And can we do it and for cheaper? Who knows? That's probably not the company I'm going to go build.
Yeah.
But I do think you can kind of look at different silos of law enforcement tech and find ways to completely up-level the current thinking based on where the underlying technology waves have gone.
One interesting space I'm thinking about too is just AI as co-pilot, that concept is broadly taking over. But if you could mesh that, this is not a thing that we're doing, but if you could mesh that with AR and VR, that seems like a perfect deployment for a law enforcement professional to have access to a LLM that is able to look at the statutory codes and understand deeper, more accurately the latest refresh of the code on what's legal, what isn't legal. You kind of could have that in your ear almost, and hopefully lead to a more responsive police force and a more just application of policing and of the law.
It's always in balance though, because I'm sure you feel this at Multitude. The thing you're competing with is not 4 other technologies that are just the same as yours. It's the fact that these guys and amazing female police officers, these guys and girls, they shoot once a year. We have, you're fighting an ammo. Moments of criticality. Does that one extra, round of going to the range actually do me better than an LLM?
Yeah. It's a valid point.
Always a critical balance.
Yeah, and often, even speaking of budget fights, we're never fighting against another technology doing what we're doing. it's ammo, but it's also like license plate reader versus what you're doing, right? It's not the DoD and the largesse of Uncle Sam as much, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then you have to go sell it not just to the police chief, but you have to sell it to the city council, you have to sell it to the mayor, and so you're not just having that budget fight on like a one-to-one basis, you're having it at scale and couple times.
Yeah, and the conversation to a city council stakeholder is very different than the one I have with chief and the one I have with the captain over investigations. It's a tripartite sale but okay. And then Morgan, the fun question I think that we should end on is something I ask every guest, which is, what's the most fun you've had lately? What's going on in your life it doesn't have to be work, but what's going on?
The most fun I've had lately. Okay, so my husband and I adopted 2 Afghan teenage girls. And so one of the most fun things has been exposing them to things that they've never been exposed to before. And so we took them skiing, which was super fun. One, because like snow at scale.
Yeah, there we go. Steepness at scale too.
Just because it's a little bit less crowded. But we took them skiing for the first time, and they got to see what it looks like when there's like 3 feet of snow on the ground, and very serene and peaceful environment, which is very different from New York City. And so they had only ever been to, Kabul, Islamabad, and New York. And so it was really fun to see. It's
going to be eye-opening.
Like really fun to see the West through the eyes.
Oh, that's amazing.
Super fun.
Yeah. Well, good for you guys too. Well, thank you for taking the time to come on. Thanks for hosting us here, and enjoyed the conversation.
And thanks for creating one small part of this ecosystem where we're actually having conversations that are in depth and not just this kind of vendor-customer divide.
Great.
Hey everybody, Matt White here. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Multitude Insights, and that's kind of my primary day job. But I started this podcast because I wanted to have conversations with the people that I found interesting. So that means the people on the front lines in law enforcement. It means the investors investing in companies, building in public safety. It means leadership and all the people that kind of make this thing work. Right. So if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to see more like it, please hit the subscribe button, the like button, the follow button, whatever it might be on whatever platform you're viewing this on. And I'd love to have you along for the journey. Talk to you soon.